Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our talks with Walt. We now turn to poem number 19 out of the 24 of the inscriptions section. This one is What Place is Besieged? Now, put this in your notes right away. We said in our discussion earlier regarding As I Pondered in Silence as well as To Thee, O Cause, that Whitman is incredibly influenced by the importance of the American Civil War. You'll remember he even said in To Thee, O Cause, my book and the war are one. We're going to come back to some of this kind of idea here in this poem, What Place is Besieged, and then ultimately we're going to find our way messing around with the same idea in the section called Drum Taps. So as we get ready to talk about that coming in our future, we'll pay attention to it right now. Now there are some assumptions. I've already mentioned prior lectures. So my assumptions are that you're already following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, finding that Talks with Walt section there, and the previous lectures that we've already given up to this text itself. Just to remind, we are the stories we tell and retell. We're obviously the stories that we decide to accept or reject. Our learning theory is always something we as well will remind ourselves of, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. The new N-E-W is the new K-N-E-W. Our annotative approach will play around with 3 levels of reading. What does the text say? Level 1, what does the text mean? Level 2, how can I relate to this information in some way? Level 3. And already notice we're making some relational kinds of observations with earlier texts that we've studied. Our Big 5 asks, what does this text say about epistemology, what one can know? Ontology, who one is, psychology, study of individual mind, sociology, study of group mind, and then finally the question of theodicy. Not why did this happen to me when bad things occur, but rather why did this happen for me? The 5 P's are the perspectives on Whitman, just to remind: Whitman as person, Whitman as poet, Whitman as pedagogue or instructor, Whitman as politician. Obviously we're going to play around a lot with that one here, and his love of democracy. And finally, Whitman as philosopher. Now, when we turn for background information, as we like to do, to kind of place all these poems that we're studying in the appropriate area, for this one, the poem was originally constituted the last 4 lines of an 8-line poem that was printed as Calamus number 31 in the 1860 Leaves of Grass edition. In the next edition, 1867, it appeared under its present title, and the first 4 lines of the original piece also became a separate piece under the title, Here, Sailor, Now What Ship Puzzled at Sea. What Place is Besieged was finally transferred to the inscriptions in 1881. So it has an interesting journey, as does a number of the poems that we're studying. Let's now study the poem. Let's read the poem. As we finish these last poems of inscriptions, you'll notice that they're very brief in terms of the number of lines. Here we'll see this as only a 4-line offering. And yet, we're still setting up ideas and themes that will be addressed throughout Leaves of Grass. Let's read the poem. What place is besieged? What place is besieged and vainly tries to raise the siege? Lo, I send to that place a commander, swift, brave, immortal, and with him horse and foot and parks of artillery and artillerymen, the deadliest that ever fired gun. Now let's turn to exactly what's going on in this poem. Right away, notice that the word place will have a repetition in lines 1 and 2. The word besieged is immediately, for your notes, war language. No question about it. In other words, being somehow attacked or held at bay. What place is besieged? And notice the adverb vainly, that is to say uselessly, tries to raise, that means to somehow combat the siege. Obviously, let's ask right away, who is this question to? This is a rhetorical question. Whitman loves these kind of questions. Is he asking it to the reader, to a group of readers? Obviously here, he wants us to think about the question of independence, the question of challenges, especially as it relates to the poet himself. And then the word lo. Now we've seen this in a number of prior poems, this use of the word lo. It's a respectful term, it's a term of emphasis. Lo, he says, I send to that place, whatever is besieged, a commander. Now we're going to get the poet-artist as a commander. a general in charge. Note the irony of this. Earlier in earlier poems, we saw the poet as father. We've seen the poet in any number of different venues. Now it's a commander, right? Swift, proud, immortal. Notice the threes. We always see these threes in Whitman. Notice the use of the word immortal. That is to say, somehow living beyond his time, right? Swift, coming quickly, brave, inhabiting that second of the four great Platonic cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Brave, courage, and then as we said, immortal. Notice the repetition of the last two lines of the anaphora with the word and with him, horse and foot, that is to say troops, and parks of artillery. So in other words, we're speaking the language of the American Civil War, and as well artillerymen, and then finally, the deadliest that ever fired gun. Now notice it's not a gun, or the guns, but rather just simply the deadliest that ever fired gun. What are we suggesting about poets and artists in this poem? They're dangerous. They're deadly. That is to say, they are liberators. Let's jump quickly to 2a. Here we will see the poet as an artist, obviously, as liberator, as supporter, as attacker, is dangerous, right? In other words, don't worry, if you're besieged, I am coming to liberate you and I will bring force as a commander as I come. It's a very interesting way to think about it. It's a very bellicose way to think about the poet and the artist, and yet this is exactly what Whitman is playing games with here. At 2b, obviously the vague audience of a rhetorical question is significant. In other words, if you are at all feeling that you are not being properly supported, he says, my book of poems is coming your way. At 3a, as we relate to other titles, I just want to point out, obviously, the power of the Declaration of Independence, right? Notice those final lines, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. We've given full lectures on this at learnstrong.net. I mentioned drum taps, and I want us to go back to that. We're going to read a lot of this kind of language later from different perspectives. And then finally, Virgil's Aeneid comes to mind, that great poem of war and sieging. I mean, in the back of Whitman's mind has to be that. And he knows that his audience of his day, in 1855, would know well the references that are being, or the allusions that are being made to the Aeneid. Finally, at 3b, how do I own a poem like this? Well, what are your thoughts? Do you think artists and poets, musicians, can be in fact dangerous in their attempts to liberate, to challenge us, to transcend and include, as we've used that language of the integralist philosophy? And how about this one? When was a time that you felt besieged and maybe an artist, a text, somehow liberated you in some way? Well, I hope that you will feel like you are being challenged to be liberated or liberate yourself through the study of these texts. Thank you.